Hello and welcome to Olde Timey Book Review, where I review books out of print, out of date, and oftentimes out of memory. In this video we'll be having a look-see at Rafael Sabatini's swashbuckling pirate adventure, The Black Swan, and more specifically this 1962 Pan Books edition, with its tantalising cover illustration. As such, this video is going to be split into two parts, the first being a consideration of Pan Books paperback editions such as this, and the second will be a review of the story of Black Swan itself. So anyway, let's begin by judging a book by its cover. In previous Olde Timey Book reviews, I've highlighted the significance of not just the text of any given book, but the particular edition of said book. This is a 1962 Pan Books reprint, with The Black Swan having been originally published in 1932. As you can see, it advertises itself as a Pan book on the top left of the cover with the text Great Pan. On the right it has a logo showing the Greek god Pan playing his flute. This logo was originally designed by Mervyn Peake, the author of the deeply imaginative Gothic fantasy of manners Titus Groan and its sequels, all set within the sprawling castle of Gormenghast. Other than being an author, he was also an illustrator, and he designed this Pan logo back in the mid-40s. It was the early days of the paperback, and Pan Books, the publisher, offered to pay Peake either a flat fee of £10 for the design, or give him royalties at a rate of 1 farthing per book. Peake sought out advice from fellow author Graham Greene, who told him that his opinion was that paperbacks were a passing fad, so it may be safer to be certain of £10 now, rather than wait for the farthings to build up. Peake took the £10. To do a little maths here, and I am in no way familiar with pre-decimalisation currency, but if there are 960 farthings in a pound, all Pan would have need to have sold is 9,601 books for Peake to have got the better deal with the royalties, and they certainly sold more than that over the next few decades. In other words, by taking the flat fee, Peake lost out. But one shouldn't judge too harshly. As I said, this was the early days of the paperback. It was only in 1935 that Alan Lane, founder of Penguin Books, brought out the first mass-market paperbacks to an English-language market, although there were precursors. And many booksellers at the time were hostile to this new format, as they were worried that this would mean that people would spend less money on books. Cheaper books, people spend less. When they arrived, the paperback was making a newer, cheaper and more portable option, not replacing the old way or diminishing the dignity of books as objects in of themselves. Moreover, as the early Penguin reprints and these Pan books were more accessible because of their price, they were most inviting to people with lower incomes. Seeking a mass readership rather than solely a refined upper-class one, these books were made highly appealing and recognisable by their tantalising cover illustrations. These were designed to draw the eye and give a potential browser in the bookshop aisle a glimpse into the kind of story they can expect. Pan Books, alongside Penguin with its clear colour coding mentioned in my Shaw video, were simple, formalised and a highly effective literary design landmarks during the post-war Cold War era in the UK, both with instantly recognisable logos. Pan Books were particularly notable in the 1960s for being the publishers of the first paperback editions of Ian Fleming's James Bond series. These vibrant illustrations helped to cement the image of the now iconic spy in the public consciousness and draw more readers to the series alongside the release of the earliest films. It's not going too far to say that with their evocative illustrations and accessible price tags, these paperbacks contributed to the rise in prominence of the character of James Bond in this period to the position of legendary popular culture figure that he is today, alongside those first Eon films, of course. Today, these early Pan books are collector's items to some, who value them for their colourful cover illustrations that so made the brand stand out at the time. To summarise, these Pan mass-market paperbacks, beginning in the 1940s and coming to prominence in the 50s and 60s, were designed to be cheap and striking additions to grab the reader's attention. Now let's look specifically at The Black Swan and its cover illustration. As you see here, this costs 2 and 6, or 2 shillings and sixpence, or, in other words, a half crown. As mentioned, I am not going to pretend to understand pre-decimalisation currency, but I believe this would be the equivalent of 12.5 pence once converted to decimalisation. But because of inflation and simply things were more affordable back then, I've seen a half crown being compared to around £1.50 in today's money. I may be wrong on this though. The point being they were affordable. What we see in the foreground on the cover is a rather fierce looking pirate with an open shirt, flexing his rapier before, presumably, a duel. He also has a pistol tucked into his belt. In the background on the left there is a group of pirates, but ahead of them is a blonde lady in a green dress who seems to be watching whatever action is about to take place with keen interest. The setting is a beach, with a large sailed ship out to sea in the distance. The sky above is largely pink and blue, but there seems to be a storm coming on the right-hand side with this black smudge. To entice the reader further, the publisher have placed the text "Buccaneering, Intrigue, Romance on the Spanish Main" on the cover, and they advertise that Rafael Sabatini is also the author of Captain Blood. The back of the book is far more simple, split into 3 parts, the first being a positive review quote, then a brief description of the 3 key characters, and finally it details what the reader can expect from the story. Fired with full-blooded action, taut with conflict and suspense, tempered by a moving love affair, this is a magnificent adventure story in the grand Sabatini tradition. What was this Sabatini tradition? Well, Rafael Sabatini was one of the great writers of historical romance adventures in the first half of the 20th century. Born in 1875, he was an Italian-English author of many works, very prolific, his most well-known being Captain Blood, Scaramouche and the Seahawk, all swashbucklers filled with sword duels and romance. In many ways he was the successor to the great swashbucklers of the 19th century such as Alexandre Dumas with Three Musketeers and Count of Monte Cristo, and Sir Anthony Hope with Prisoner of Zenda. Anyways, the story. It begins aboard the Centaur, a ship headed for England with 2 notable passengers aboard. These are Miss Priscilla Harradine, the 24-year-old daughter of the former Captain General of the Leeward Islands, and her 40-something chaperone, Major Bartholomew Sands. Now that her father is dead, Priscilla is returning to England to live with her aunt, although Major Sands, a friend of her father, has designs to make her his respectable, compliant wife. Priscilla, however, having lived a rather sheltered life, now seeks a certain degree of adventure. This curiosity is further kindled by the arrival of a 3rd passenger on the Centaur, a dandyish Frenchman by the name of Monsieur Charles de Bernis, a master fencer and right-hand man of former pirate and now Governor of Jamaica, Sir Henry Morgan. Priscilla takes a great interest in Charles, and this rather displeases the stuffy Major Sands. Matters get complicated on the voyage when the Centaur is captured by one of the few remaining pirate crews in the Caribbean, the Black Swan, led by the brutish and bloodthirsty Captain Leach. The crew of the Centaur are killed, but Bernis, having been a pirate and acquainted with Captain Leach, tells Leach that he was actually on a journey searching for him, as he has knowledge of a Spanish treasure fleet that the combination of de Bernis' mind and Leach's might could take. De Bernis tells the captain that he seeks to return to pirating and has left Henry Morgan, the traitor against all pirates, to capture this Spanish fortune. Leach takes the bait. Also, de Bernis, wishing to preserve the life of Priscilla, and, to a much lesser extent, Major Sands, tells Leach that Priscilla is his wife, and Major Sands is his brother-in-law. This puts them under his protection, and in the rather difficult position of the Frenchman and Priscilla having to pretend they are married, which angers Major Sands as he is sidelined as a moping brother-in-law. Of course, Priscilla sees the logic in going with this falsehood, as it is clear that her life and well-being would be in danger if she were not directly tied to the man with knowledge of the Spanish treasure fleet. It is because of this knowledge that the pirates want to remain on the Frenchman's good side, as he only tells them part of what he knows, making it clear that he does not trust them enough to tell them all at so early a stage. Leach makes it clear to his subordinates that he intends to double-cross de Bernis, as soon as the treasure is his, and take the Frenchman's young wife too, but will humour him until then. Going by the information Denis has, there is over a month until the treasure fleet is to set sail, which will give them plenty of time for important preparations. At the top of this list for Denis is the matter of Leech's ship, the Black Swan, which strikes fear into the heart of all merchant sailors, but is in dire need of maintenance. You see, while Leech may be the best captain for a pirate crew in a fight, he is impatient and lacks certain wisdom when it comes to the day-to-day care of the ship. Denis observes that the ship is laying heavy in the water, evidence that the hull is weighed down by barnacles. This slows the ship down, and in any pursuit, as Denis points out, could lead to them losing their prize. Even though Leech would rather rush to the place where they are to meet the treasure fleet, he agrees to careen his ship in a secret cove that Denis knows amongst a set of islands that no one visits. Careening, I should add, is the act of beaching a ship so that it is on its side, and therefore making it possible to dry the hull, remove the barnacles, caulk the gaps, tar the hull, and generally get it seaworthy again. They careen the Black Swan, and the drama moves to the shore. I won't spoil the rest of the story, but instead I'll read a passage at the beginning of chapter 13, just over halfway through, to give a demonstration of Sabatini's skill and wit with dialogue, and also to serve as a general taste of the tone overall. The Black Swan, chapter 13. On the following morning, whilst Major Sands was sulking like Achilles in his tent, a shadow fell across the entrance, and Monsieur Denis stood before him in black silhouette against the sunlight. He carried his sheathed rapier tucked under his arm. "I have observed, Major, that you grow too fat," was the greeting with which he startled the soldier. "You need to sweat a little, and to stretch your limbs. It will mend your humours. Take up your sword, and come with me." The Major, remembering the sharp words that had passed between them yesterday, conceived in this derisory invitation to an adjustment of their differences. He got to his feet, with quickened breath and deepening colour. "Blister me, sir! Do ye seek to put a quarrel on me? Have ye thought what will happen if I kill you?" "I never build conjectures on the impossible." "By God, sir, your insolence is not to be borne, not to be borne!" He snatched up sword and sword belt. "Have with you, then, whatever the consequences." Monsieur Denis sighed. "Always you be misunderstanding me. I propose exercise, and you talk of killing." "Whatever you propose, I am your man, stab me!" They went out together, the Major breathing gustily, Denis calm and apparently amused. Their departure was unwitnessed by Miss Priscilla, and, so that it should go unperceived by others, Denis penetrated the wood for some little distance, then, under cover of the trees, led the way along a line parallel with the shore. They went in silence until the Major, suspecting that they were being followed, halted to look behind him. "It's only Pierre," said Denis, without looking round. "He comes to see that we are not interrupted." The Major plunged on, mystified, indignant, yet with no thought of avoiding an encounter upon which the other appeared determined, whatever might be the consequences. He panted up the rising ground that ran inwards from the bluff, and was bathed in perspiration by the time Denis had brought him out onto the little beach beyond it, and screened by it from the encampment of the buccaneers. On the summit of the bluff, the Major saw now the figure of Pierre, and understood that he was posted there on guard. Monsieur Denis removed his baldric and drew his sword. The Major copied him in silence. Then from his pocket the Frenchman took a piece of wood that was shaped like a tiny pear, with a slot opened at its apex. Into this slot, under the Major's bulging, uncomprehending eyes, he fitted the point of his sword, then tapped down the little wooden pear securely, with a stone which he picked up from the beach. "What the devil is this?" quoth the Major. Monsieur Denis brought forth a second wooden object, like the first, and proffered it. "Did you suppose I brought you on a bloodletting? Our situation would hardly admit of it, whatever may be your feelings. I told you you need to breathe your lungs, and stretch your limbs, and sweat a little." But now the Major, who was already sweating freely and at every pore, and who conceived himself mocked, flung into a real passion. "What the devil do you mean, sir? Do you rally me? Do ye practise jests upon me?" "Oh, but a little calm," the other begged. The need for bloodletting may yet be thrust upon us. With rust we lack for practice. I do, if you do not, Major. That is all. And more insistently he proffered the wooden pair again. Between doubt and understanding, the Major slowly took the object. I see, which was an obvious overstatement. It is for practice that you bring me here. And he grumbled, You should have made it plainer. Could I suppose that it was not plain? Daubigny was beginning to remove his doublet. The Major was glad enough to copy him in this. Then, as the thought of what they came to do grew upon him, a certain grim satisfaction grew with it. He had notions of himself as a swordsman. In younger days, at home, he had been the deadliest blade of his regiment. He would show this Frenchman something that would let him see that Major Sands was not a man with whom it was prudent to take liberties. At last, stripped to the waist, they faced each other and came on guard. I think that'll do. That should give you an idea of Sabatini's signature style. I should add that I had already read both Captain Blood and Scaramouche before trying the Black Swan, and the Black Swan is one of Sabatini's lesser works. It's certainly less cited, and if I was to recommend a Sabatini book to start on, it would be Scaramouche, not the Black Swan. But that's not to imply, however, that the Black Swan is a bad book. I read it at the height of summer, that is to say those few days in England where we have a summer, and as such I found it engaging enough for a light, relatively short paperback. It was a joy to lay back in the warmth and read this swashbuckling yarn, a tad predictable perhaps, but no worse for it. If you want a story with a little romance, a little peril, a goodly number of pirates, and like what you've heard of Sabatini's writing style, then there's no reason not to search out a copy for yourself. Sabatini, although his name isn't as famous as it once was, is an author more than worth looking out and searching out if you are a reader of the historical adventure fiction. I will add as well that I first discovered this book, and Sabatini more generally, while I was researching the Tyrone Power film, The Black Swan. If you're interested in film stardom, Tyrone Power and the like, I have a video on the channel that looks into Tyrone Power and also the production of The Black Swan in one section. But the story of The Black Swan and the story of The Black Swan, the film and the book, are quite different. It's more just taking the name of a Sabatini book because he was such a popular historical adventure fiction author at the time. Other film adaptations include silent versions of Captain Blood, Scaramouche, which stars Roman Navarro. There's a famous King Vidor lost and now largely rediscovered 1926 adaptation of Bardley's The Magnificent, which was the second film that John Wayne ever appeared in. There were also notable Errol Flynn starring adaptations of Captain Blood and the Seahawk in the 30s and 40s. But in relation to the book, although the film is called The Black Swan, it can only be said to be loosely based on the original story. All that really carries over from the story of the book of The Black Swan to the 1942 film is some of the names, the connection to the historical figure of Sir Henry Morgan, pirate turned Governor of Jamaica, and the hunting of a ship called the Black Swan and its captain named Leach. Also there is a subplot of a lady, Lady Margaret Denby, played by Maureen O'Hara, having to pretend to be the husband of one pirate, the anti-hero Jamie Waring, played by Tyrone Power, to protect her from the rest of the pirate crew.
And I say Captain Leach is a gibbering ape fit only for the company of baboons. Gentlemen, Captain Leach is in a temper.
Although it may be an adaptation in the loosest sense, I would also recommend the film here in this review of the book, as it is a thoroughly enjoyable, old-fashioned, Technicolor swashbuckler. I also make no secret of my fondness for the performances of Tyrone Power. Now that I'm veering awfully close to going off topic, it's probably time to wrap up. Thank you for joining me. I hope you found this review of the 1962 Pan Books edition of The Black Swan in some way enlightening. By examining this book, we've looked at the early days of the paperback and specifically pan books and the way in which they place these evocative illustrations on the cover to entice readers to pick up these cheap and cheerful little volumes. We also talked about the popularity of the adventure author Rafael Sabatini and some of the film adaptations of his works. And in this book review we also found time to talk about the text itself and the story itself, which surprised me. If you are familiar with Rafael Sabatini and have any suggestions, please do put them in the comments with some detail of why you're suggesting this or that of his work. But for now, thank you for joining me. I hope you join me again for another Old Timey Book review, and toodles!